Hello and welcome to your daily dose of game news sizzle with me, Jon Jordan. Today we are considering Nintendo's Switch console, and in particular we are looking at it in the context of Nintendo's past two console launches. So we have the 3DS, which was launched in 2011, handheld console, still in production. And we also are looking at Switch in comparison with the Wii U. That was Nintendo's last home console. That was released in 2012 and discontinued in 2016. And not only are 3DS and Wii U Nintendo's past two consoles, they also provide a more interesting comparison because the 3DS is a handheld console and the Wii U is a home console. And of course Switch can be used in both modes, so portable and connected to your big TV at home. So quite a deep comparison we get from looking at Switch in this context. So onto our first graph. As you can see here, what do we got here? So this is the quarterly shipments from launch of the three consoles. So the first two quarters I've done as bar charts. That's because we only at the moment have 2 quarters of Switch data from Nintendo. And then after that we have 2 lines, so we have the 3DS and the Wii U lines of quarterly shipments, cumulative I should say, so it goes up every quarter. And I've done those as lines. It's a bit easier to see because we've got this kind of I guess kind of I would call it a zone of uncertainty when it comes to Switch. We're going to be getting the next load of data from Nintendo's financials next week, so we'll be able to fill in where it switches in terms of Q3 figures then. But we're kind of, in this video at least, looking a bit more long-term, looking at Q4 and Q5. So what do we got? Look at Q1 to begin with, and this is shipments from Nintendo's financials. So we can see in terms of which console shipped the most. 3DS shipped the most, marginally. Wii U actually shipped a pretty good number, so 3DS shipped over 3 million, Wii shipped about 3, and Switch, they shipped 2.7 million of those. Looking on to Q2, you can kind of see what's happening here. 3DS increased, Wii didn't really increase at all, a very small amount, and actually Switch increased quite a lot. So by the second quarter, Switch was the had shipped the most. So at the moment, Nintendo has shipped 4.7 million Switches globally. You should also point out that these quarters are not calendar quarters. So actually the 3DS and Switch were both released globally in March of their respective years. Wii was interesting, it actually shipped in November, December, so in a holiday season, so that's why its first quarter was quite big, and then progressively dropped away. You can also see this if we look at the 3DS line, the green line, so we can see there's a big jump from Q3 to Q4, what I've called here Y1, and that's because that's a holiday quarter, so that's obviously when these consoles sell their most units is during the December quarter. So let's have a look at this zone of uncertainty, which I have shaded in blue. So why do we have this uncertainty? Well, Nintendo has released guidance. So for its first quarter, Nintendo shipped 2.7 million Switches, we know that. And then, because it entered a new financial year, so Nintendo's financial year starts the 1st of April and runs to the 31st of March. So into that next financial year, Nintendo said it was expected to ship 10 million Switches, and that's for the period, the 12-month period ending 31st of March 2018. So the bottom dot which says Nintendo guidance, that is the 10 million number added to the 2.7 million it switched in the it shipped of the Switch. Get lots of S's there in Switch's launch quarter. So that gives us 12.7. Now that is now seen as a very conservative guidance indeed. We've had rumours, and there have been rumours from supply chain, the people who are basically involved in the manufacture of Switch, that Nintendo was kind of making about 1 million a month. That was its production line. It has 2 manufacturers at the moment. And because demand is so high, the rumours are that Nintendo was looking to double that, so looking to make 2 million Switches a month. So 6 million a quarter, that would be happening then. So that's why we have this now, this market estimate for what will happen. Now the problem we have with this, it's a rumor clearly, so we don't know if it's true. And the other thing is, even if Nintendo could get to the state of manufacturing 2 million Switches every month, we're not quite sure when that would happen. So could that be happening right now? Could it be happening already? Could in November and December Nintendo produce 4 million Switches as opposed to 2 million, is what we kind of expect? This is more complicated because it looks like Nintendo is trying to add at least one or two more manufacturing partners. So obviously it has to set up the production lines and go through all the quality assurance that you set up when you start a production line. So given the global demand for Switch, no doubt Nintendo will increase its supply from this kind of nominal 1 million a month, but we're not quite sure when this extra production will come online, or exactly how much production will come online. But there's a market estimate that would kind of suggest by the end of March 2018, Nintendo may have shipped over 20 million. There are some people who think it could have shipped even more, but for me that seems a little bit too much. So taking a step back and looking at the graph in total, we have looking at Nintendo's guidance. If Nintendo's guidance was correct, Switch over 5 quarters would have shipped a lot more than Wii U. Wii U was a failure, discontinued, having sold less than 15 million units. 3DS, a success, so currently up to 67 million units and still selling about 7 million a year. So we can see Switch kind of sits quite neatly in between the two. However, there is a good chance, I think, that we would see, certainly by Q5, Q6, Switch potentially overtaking 3DS, which really shows the success of the console to date. So this graph is looking at annual shipments of the hardware, the 3DS, the Switch and the Wii U. So we can see kind of a similar thing. Again, this is not calendar year, so this is not how many shipped in 2011, 2012. This is how many shipped 12 months on from the launch quarter. So we can see we shipped actually the most Wii's were shipped in the first year. So this is not a cumulative graph. This is just how many shipped in a year. So we can see Wii shipped the most in its first year and then progressively sold about 3 million units and then dropped away in the fourth year, and then there was no fifth year for Wii U, discontinued. We can see for 3DS sold 15 million in the first year, shipped 15 million in the first year. Probably most of those were sold, but Nintendo's numbers are for units it shipped into retail. It doesn't look at retail figures. So the first year again actually sold the most in the first year, but the second year was pretty much 15 million, dropped away in year 3 a little bit, and then year 4, 5 and 6 dropped quite considerably, say now selling about 7 million units. And obviously with 3DS, it's gone through quite a lot of hardware variations. So you had the 3DS, you had the 3D XL, the bigger version. You had the 2DX, which didn't have the 3D and didn't have the folding case. Now you have the 2D XL, so there's always different variants, and obviously there's different pricing for them as well. So that's how Nintendo kind of controls the lifespan of this hardware. But the thing we care about, I guess, is Switch. So we can see here in the darker blue, that's the 4.7 million units of Switch that have been shipped already. So that's really kind of a half-year figure. We can see I've got in a slightly lighter blue, based on Nintendo's guidance. So this idea of maybe kind of 12.7 million, which we think is conservative. And then we have a figure that's kind of based on the fact that 2 million units of Switch might be suddenly produced every month instead of 1 million. How quickly can that happen? Well, it's an estimate. So I've got that coming through at under 15 million, maybe about 14 million, just over 14 million units in its first year. That could be higher. We don't really know when this extra production will come on board. But my gut feeling is Switch probably won't beat 3DS in the first year, the first 12 months. But then in year 2, if Nintendo has got up to 2 million units production capacity a month, clearly then we're looking at 24 million units produced. Now this is a bit more spurious because we don't know if demand will support 24 million units of Switch in a year. So clearly at the moment you can say Nintendo could sell probably 15 million units. Certainly it's a slightly different kind of global variation. So in Japan, um, demand for Switch is very heavy, but that's partly because it's Nintendo has shipped very few Switches to Japan. So there's only 1.1 million of the 4.7 million Switches produced so far in the first 2 quarters anyway have gone to Japan. And it's the same thing for what Nintendo calls the Americas, so mainly the North American market. That's only received 2 million Switches in terms of the quarters that Nintendo has formally announced numbers for. The rest of the world, mainly Europe at this stage, has received 1.6 million Switches. And actually in Europe, Switch isn't particularly hard to find. If you certainly in the UK and most parts of Europe, if you want to buy a Switch, you just go into a shop and buy buy one. In Japan, you can't find them. America, similar to Japan, not quite as constrained, but quite hard to find them. So we are in this kind of interesting state talking about year 2 already. We just don't know how many Switch units can be produced. The other thing, it is a $300 piece of hardware, so that's not nothing. That's when the 3DS came out, it was $250. So there's a pricing point there as well. But this just gives you an idea of what could happen. And it does also show that if Nintendo could sell 24 million Switches or ship 24 million Switches in a year, that's pretty impressive compared to the 3DS and the Wii U. And on to our final graph. So instead of looking at hardware, this is looking at what we call the tie ratio. So this is the total units of software Nintendo ships divided by the hardware it ships. So basically, on average, how many games does each person who own a console purchase? So again, I've done this kind of bar charts for the first 2 quarters and then lines so we can see a bit easier what's going on. So looking back at the first quarter, we can see, maybe surprisingly, but when you think about it, not surprisingly actually, but, Wii U had a very high tie ratio. That was partly because it shipped into the holiday season, so people bought more games for it. So almost 4 games per Wii U bought when it came out, and that level actually continued. And you can see by the end of the second year, it was between 4 and 5 games per Wii U unit bought. Now, this was partly the reason for this was that not many Wii U units were actually shipped after the first quarter. So obviously you had a hardcore audience who really liked Wii U and really liked Wii U games, and they tend to buy more games than if Wii U had gone very mass market very quickly, and that kind of audience or that kind of gamer maybe buys 1 or 2 games a year, normally around Christmas. The other thing is home consoles always have a higher tie ratio than portable handheld consoles. So that's kind of the trend really we're seeing with we saw with Wii U. So similar trend, I guess, with 3DS. We can see it started out between 2 and 3 games per unit shipped to begin with. Next quarter went over 2, then dropped down again. That's partly because as the number of hardware units shipped increased, particularly during the holiday season, those people were buying 1 or 2 games. They weren't suddenly buying 3 games, even though they just bought a console. So you tend to find when hardware launches, the tie ratio kind of peaks and then drops down a little bit as more units kind of flow into the market. And we can see over the 2-year period with 3DS, it kind of settled down about 3 games per unit of hardware sold. Now we can see where we are with Switch. So Switch, first quarter, it 2 games per unit sold, and then second quarter actually increased to 3. Now, interestingly, because there was complaints about the quality of Switch's software at launch. Actually, when we look back at the year, or when we do look back at the year, Switch will actually have had quite a strong hardware support, at least from Nintendo. So it obviously switched with Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, which was actually released for Wii U at the same time, but was kind of the launch title for Switch. And then that was followed up by Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, so a kind of remake, an enhanced version of Mario Kart 8, which was originally released for Wii. So 2 strong games there from Nintendo. Also ARMS, which was a kind of a new IP that did okay, did about 1 million units, and Splatoon 2 has come out, and then obviously we have the big one, Super Mario Odyssey, which is coming out actually this week. So it would be no surprise to see Switch kind of maintaining this kind of 3 games kind of tie ratio, and you can see Nintendo has got guidance in there again. So Nintendo every year has guidance for how many hardware units it thinks it will ship, also for how many software units it thinks it will ship. So for the 12 months ending 31st of March 2018, Nintendo thinks 35 million software units will ship for Switch. So if we do the math on that, that gives us at Q5, that gives us a tie ratio of just over 3. So how could that change? Well, obviously people could buy more games. People who buy a Switch could go, that's loads of really great games for it. I'll buy more. And it's interesting that suddenly now Switch has a lot of support from third-party publishers. So you have EA has released FIFA 18. We've also got some kind of really interesting games that you wouldn't expect coming to Wii. So Bethesda is releasing a version of Doom, another shooter, Wolfenstein 2. Rockstar Games is doing a version of LA Noire, which is an old console game, but it's kind of remastering it in a sense for Switch. We had stuff from Ubisoft as well. So quite a lot of interesting games coming out there that could raise the tie ratio a bit. Obviously, if Nintendo actually ship more Switches, that would tend to decrease the tie ratio because the more hardware units that come out, those people tend not to immediately jump on board and buy 3 games. But we don't know how that's going to play out. And we have less kind of less visibility of the uncertainty around that, I suppose. But what's interesting and what's important in the long term is Nintendo, when it sells Switches, doesn't really make much money on them. Where it makes the money clearly is the hardware. So the higher the tie ratio, the more money Nintendo is making from selling games, whether that's from Nintendo games or third-party games. And clearly over time the tie ratio increases because as people have a console, they might buy 1 or 2 games over the year. So it will increase over time, but it's just we just really need to get a bit more data to see how Switch is comparing in the early stages of its career to the 3DS and the Wii U. So anyway, that was quite a lot of depth about Switch, and I think the reason that Switch is interesting is there's a lot of strong kind of speculation around its success. So even from the start, people were saying, oh, it could outsell Wii, which is Nintendo's best-selling console ever. That still, I think, is open to interpretation. I think at the moment, I would be saying if it outsells 3DS, that would be a success, because we do have with Nintendo this kind of quite strong core fan base who will buy pretty much anything Nintendo puts out. And I think that's still the case for Switch, that they will be buying Switch. But then when we get to like the maybe 15-20 million Switches sold, then a new audience has to be engaged. And I think there's still some uncertainty about whether Switch is seen as a home console or a portable. And that is maybe something Nintendo has to work out in its marketing and perhaps pricing as well as Switch enters its 2nd and 3rd year. But a long way off. At the moment, we can definitely say Switch has launched well, and the is selling games, has a strong support in terms of software as well. So we expect Nintendo's kind of share price to continue to be strong. Not really expecting any changes there. Probably the only thing that would happen is more upward pressure, I would imagine, particularly around the launch of Switch in China, which doesn't have an official date yet, but is expected to sometime in 2018. So the earlier that happens, the more confident Nintendo will be that it's fixed that it's managed to increase its production. Because obviously China is a very big market, could be a very big market for Switch, and it could be selling tens of millions of units in there if it's a successful launch. So Nintendo has to be certain it's got its production right before it enters China. So anyway, that's enough game sizzle for today. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to subscribe, and hope to see you again soon.